Welcome back to Great Life, Great Career. Here's your host, Scott Miller.
Welcome back, everyone. Scott Miller, host of Great Life, Great Career. As I mentioned in our introduction, our theme today is talking to crazy, how to communicate with the people that drive you nuts. Joining us now is renowned psychiatrist and best-selling author, business advisor Mark Goulston, author of multiple books, including Just Listen and Get Out of Your Way, talking today around his newest book called Talking to Crazy, how to deal with the irrational and impossible people in your life. Mark, welcome to Great Life, Great Career.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to try and keep up with your enthusiasm, Scott.
Well, I was kind of born this way. It's God-given. But, there are topics that I am enthused about, and this one is phenomenal. Before I introduced you this morning, I talked about how we all have crazy in our life, and we are the crazy in some other people's lives. So I'm hoping that today, from this two-part conversation with you, Mark, that everyone will be a little more introspective on how they can minimize their crazy in others' lives and how they can, as you call it, lean into crazy with people in their lives. Mark, you are an advisor, coach, mentor. You're a confidant to CEOs. You're originally a UCLA professor. You're a renowned psychiatrist. You write for HBR, Business Insider, Fast Company, HuffPo, you name it. Talk a bit about why you wrote this book and kind of what your journey was to learn about this topic around the crazy in our lives.
Well, in my book, Just Listen, which did very well around the world, I speak around the world trying to teach the world to listen to each other. I don't speak that much on listening in America because Americans are becoming the world's worst listeners, but that's a whole other story. But in my book, Just Listen, there were two chapters that got people's attention and I got a lot of interviews on. One was called Steering Clear of Toxic People. And then there was another chapter which was how to go from OF to OK, and we'll call that O fudge. And it's a way to talk yourself down when people make you a little crazy, and how to so that you can interact with them. And so I got so many interviews in those two chapters, I figured why not write a book on talking to crazy. And I need to say, Scott, because it's interesting, I took a lot of heat from the psychological and psychiatric professions. They'll say, you're a psychiatrist, Mark, and we're fighting stigma. Why did you call it this title? I said, well, because it's not about mental illness. It's about people that drive you crazy. And if it was a vanilla milkshake title, you wouldn't be calling me.
Yeah, good point. Mark, I want to toggle back and forth between some of the concepts in your book, Talking to Crazy, and also Just Listen. In the opening of your book, Talking to Crazy, you talk a little bit about the science behind crazy. And again, you mentioned in there that you don't mean to disparage people and you differentiate between mental illness and kind of the craziest in our lives. You do a nice job, I think, of really respecting the difference. You talk a bit about what you call the kind of the three brains. Would you talk a little bit about the science behind kind of how crazy happens in our brain?
Well, by three brains, there's something called the triune brain. It was first named by, I think, Paul MacLean, and it means we have three functional brains. We have an upper thinking human brain, we have a middle emotional mammalian brain, and we have a lower reptile fight or flight or freeze brain. And it's interesting, when I was researching this, mammals like dogs and cats, they get ulcers because they have emotions, but reptiles don't get ulcers. Snakes, turtles, and whatever, because they don't have emotions. I found that fascinating. And so when it comes to crazy, what happens is the people that drive us crazy have a way of so appalling us, frustrating, or angering us that it triggers something in our mammalian brain. There's something called an amygdala, which is like a point guard. And when they trigger our amygdala, it basically hijacks us away from being able to think. So the bullies, the whiners, the complainers, they push us into our rage. And if you're not comfortable with rage, you spend all your time trying to keep a lid on it.
Mark, your stories in this book, Talking to Crazy, I think are what makes it so relatable. You opened the book and you shared this story about yourself and about a driving instance and you then kind of translate it into this concept you've coined called leaning into crazy. Would you share that real life story, what you did, and how that kind of provides the basis for this coping technique around leaning in?
Yeah, I don't know why I'm laughing at the story, but maybe your listeners will chuckle because I'm sure you did. So what happened is I was having a terrible day, and I was driving in Los Angeles, and I cut someone off in a big pickup truck. And, and they flashed their lights, but I was so preoccupied, I cut them off again. And they pulled in front of me, and they stopped, and there was this big, 6'5", brawny guy, and I see that I'm really kind of confused. His wife was saying to him, "Don't do it, don't go out there." And I'm just watching their silhouettes, and he comes out of his car, and he bangs on my window. And because I'm so confused, I roll the window down. Other people would say, "You don't roll the window down." And I said, "What?" He said, "You cut me off twice, I'm gonna deck you." He was very threatening. And I looked at him, and I said, "Do you ever have one of those days where everything you touch turns to crap, and you're hoping you'll find someone who will put you out of your misery? Are you the guy?" And he looks at me and says, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I don't cut people off. I mean, it's a terrible day. Everything I've done is wrong. Are you the guy who's going to put me out of my misery?" And he looks at me, and he immediately flips. He says, "No, calm down." I said, "Well, it's easy for you to say. You didn't have such a day like I'm doing." And he's saying, No, I really mean it. Calm down, calm down." I said, "Well, yeah, it's easy for you to say." And then he goes back into his pickup truck, and he looks into the rearview mirror, and he waves to me like, "It'll be okay." And then he drives off.
Good luck to you, sir, right?
That's right. Now, I'm not sure how I came up with that, except, I am a hostage negotiation trainer. I've been in lots of life and death situations. So even though I was confused, it may be that I had sort of this built-in training in my head about how to disarm people, but it was kind of funny.
Our guest today is Dr. Mark Goulston, apparently the comedic psychiatrist that we all have come to love, renowned authority on listening and helping to deal with kind of the crazy in our life. Talk a little bit about this concept of lean in. You kind of shared the story. You also share a metaphor about a dog. Give people kind of their first kind of coping technique around how do they implement this lean in strategy with people who are causing crazy in our lives.
So the metaphor about a dog is if a dog bites your arm and you try to pull it out, its teeth dig in. So what you need to do is push your arm into their mouth, and they'll open their mouth because they're going to be choking on it. And I'm going to give people something that they can use immediately that it's magical. So if you're ever in an argument or someone is venting at you and they're what you do is instead of saying, "Now calm down," because that's just going to agitate them, let them finish. Let them vent. Wait 2 seconds and look them, in the eye, not threateningly, but directly. And that's going to indicate that you actually listen to them and you're not pushing back. And this is what you say to them, Scott. You could say, "You sound frustrated, and I think you're holding back." And they're going to go, "What?" So and they're going to say, "Yeah, you sound frustrated, and I think you're holding back because I think you're also really disappointed and angry. So tell me what's that all about?" And it is magical because, you can tell someone you seem frustrated, they don't get defensive. If you say to someone, "You seem angry," it sounds like you're scolding them. But when you lead, when you sound frustrated, and then invite them to sort of verbally punch themselves out with what they're disappointed and angry about, it's fascinating. It's fascinating what happens. A friend of mine did that, and he said it not only he became compassionate. This was towards his wife. He became so compassionate about what a jerk he was, and he said, "Why did you stay with me?" And by this time, she got it all off her chest. Her amygdala hijack stopped. She calmed down. She smiled. She said, "You're basically a good guy. You just act like a jerk."
Mark, how do most of us differentiate between, true mental illness in our friends and boss and leader and colleagues, spouse, and people who just are having what you call that amygdala hijack or having, tough days? Are there any kind of layman's tips you might give us to say, yeah, I really can't even help this because this is out of my realm?
Well, I think mental illness, it's a matter of, is it continuing over time? Because upset happens to everyone every day. There's something that upsets everyone. And I actually wrote a recent article about mental health. What does it mean to be mentally healthy? And what I wrote about is upsets occur to all of us every day. And the more mentally healthy you are, the more you can feel the upset, take the hit, meaning you feel it, but then you don't hit back and do something destructive to others or yourself. So the more mentally healthy you are, the more you can deal with upset that way and just absorb it. It doesn't mean you roll over and let someone bully you, but you take the hit, and then you're able to address it in a firm but direct but not crazy way. Whereas the more unhealthy you are, the more thin-skinned you are.
It's true. Yeah.
The more destructive you get as soon as someone tweaks you.
Mark, I found the book to be especially relevant, and I highly recommend this book to anybody listening today because you spend kind of equal time talking about how to deal with other people's crazy, but you also spend some time about self-reflection and kind of your own brand of crazy, and that the role that negative messages about ourselves play in our own degree of craziness. Give us some tips for those of us who kind of know we have our own crazy. What are some things we could be aware of, mindful of, and mitigate that accentuate or ramp up our own version of crazy? We all have that.
We all do have that. One of the things I would recommend, especially if you're thinking about the people you deal with on a regular basis versus strangers, make a list of all the people in your life that tend to drive you crazy and never expect them not to drive you crazy. In other words, when you're in a conversation with them or you're texting each other, always expect them at some point to drive you crazy, get angry, get accusatory, get pouty, get sullen. And so, because one of the things that triggers us is when we're caught off balance, the way people really get to us is they sort of push us into our uncontrollable anger or rage, and then we're just trying to keep a lid on it. So always expect them to do something that normally drives you crazy, and then when that happens, hold a little bit of yourself back, and you can say to yourself internally, "Dang, they just did it again." Let them finish what they're saying. And then you can pause and you can say, you seem frustrated, disappointed, and angry. Or you can say, could you run that by me again? Because the way you were saying it to me, it just got me all kind of, twisted. And it seemed really important. So could you run that by me again?
Mark, before we go...
to diffuse it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mark, before we go to break, I want to ask you a question. I think that, and you validate this, that, fighting and arguing with our spouse or our significant other is kind of a commonplace given in relationships. But it doesn't mean you have to dislike them or don't want to be with them. You coined a phrase, you call it rope-a-dope. Talk a bit about that as a relationship tool when we find ourselves arguing with our significant other.
Well, doing a rope-a-dope, it goes after the Muhammad Ali, George Foreman fight where you just allow them to vent. And as I mentioned, if you get them to vent it all out, where you get them to express their frustration, disappointment, and anger, and you're inviting them to do that, you will watch them actually diffuse. Something else that I think really helps is, and this is the simplest way to stop an argument. If you can pause and ask yourself, what's it like for the other person right now? I did that with my wife some years ago, and we were getting into a tiff and it was escalating. And then I asked myself, what's it like for her right now? And I realized she didn't like it any more than me. So instead of trading verbal tweaks at each other, I paused and I said, you don't like where this is going any more than I do you? She says, oh, I hate it when it goes this way. I said, do you have any idea how we can keep it from going there? And she smiled at me and she said, no, but you're doing good.
Our guest today is Dr. Mark Goulston, renowned psychiatrist, business advisor, CEO coach, author of numerous books, including Talking to Crazy, How to Deal with the Irrational and Impossible People in Your Life. Mark, this book's done phenomenally well. In fact, I think I've heard it's actually done uniquely well in Russia. What do you make about the launch and the resonance of this book in Russia?
Well, a lot of it has to do with titling. So the Russian title, and I'll have to slightly modify it, but the Russian title is How to Talk with A-Holes. And it's gone viral. And I actually told the publisher, I said, oh, before it goes out in paperback, can we change the title? And they said, we just got acquired by HarperCollins, so there's a lot of moving parts there. Plus, It's in the catalog. We'll stick with Talking to Crazy.
We're going to come back with Dr. Mark Goulston on the second and talk about some coping skills, some very practical skills on what we can do to for tactics around talking to crazy. And we'll also spend some time kind of pulling out some of his insight around why he's so passionate about listening, why listening is so important in our relationships. You've been listening to Scott Miller. This is Great Life, Great Career. Don't go away. You'll want to hear the next segment with Dr. Mark Goulston.